The Pacific War was not just another front of World War II. It was a different kind of conflict altogether, vast, brutal, and fought across endless oceans, remote islands, and jungles where nature itself became an enemy. This war would redefine modern combat, introduce new levels of psychological and physical endurance, and push soldiers, sailors, pilots, and civilians beyond the limits of human survival. In this video, you will witness how the Pacific became a battlefield, how strategies evolved under extreme conditions, and how real men lived, fought, and died in one of the most unforgiving theaters of war in history. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Pacific Ocean instantly transformed from a trade route into a war zone stretching thousands of miles. Unlike Europe, where borders were visible and cities were familiar, the Pacific offered nothing but water, coral, jungle, and heat. Control of tiny islands, often no more than strips of sand or volcanic rock, became a matter of life and death for entire nations. Each island could serve as an airfield, a naval base, or a stepping stone toward total victory. One of the most striking facts about the Pacific War was its sheer scale. The distances involved were unlike anything seen before. Ships could sail for weeks without seeing land. Pilots flew missions knowing that a single mechanical failure meant certain death in the open ocean. Supply lines stretched across half the globe, making logistics as deadly as enemy fire. American and Japanese commanders quickly realized that winning the Pacific would require not just firepower, but endurance, innovation, and an iron will. The environment itself became a silent killer. Tropical diseases such as malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and jungle rot claimed more soldiers than bullets on many islands. In places like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, soldiers fought battles while starving, dehydrated, and sick. Veterans later recalled that the jungle never slept. Insects crawled into wounds, rain rotted equipment, and the constant humidity destroyed weapons and morale alike. Unlike the war in Europe, the Pacific War was deeply shaped by cultural beliefs and ideologies. Japanese military doctrine emphasized honor, sacrifice, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. Surrender was considered shameful. This belief would later lead to fanatical resistance, suicide charges, and battles fought literally to the last man. For Allied troops, especially Americans and Australians, this mindset came as a terrifying shock. They were facing an enemy who did not retreat, did not surrender, and often preferred death over capture. One of the earliest lessons of the Pacific War was learned during the fall of the Philippines in 1942. American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur were overwhelmed by the Japanese advance. Despite fierce resistance, lack of supplies and air support sealed their fate. The infamous Bataan Death March followed, a brutal, forced march where thousands of prisoners of war died from starvation, disease, and execution. Veterans later recalled that it was a living nightmare, a clear signal of how merciless the Pacific War would become. Naval warfare took on an entirely new character in the Pacific. Battleships, once considered the kings of the sea, were rapidly overshadowed by aircraft carriers. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 would become a turning point. For the first time in history, major naval combat was decided without opposing ships ever seeing each other. Planes launched from carriers struck enemy fleets hundreds of miles away. In a matter of hours, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, a blow from which it would never fully recover. The Pacific War also marked the rise of amphibious warfare on an unprecedented scale. Landing troops on hostile shores required precise coordination between Navy, Air Force, and infantry. Early landings were chaotic and deadly. At places like Tarawa, American Marines were cut down by machine gun fire as they struggled through shallow reefs under intense enemy fire. Bodies piled up on the beaches, and commanders were forced to adapt tactics in real time to avoid total disaster. Island hopping became the defining strategy of the Allied advance. Rather than capturing every Japanese-held island, Allied forces targeted strategically important locations, bypassing heavily fortified positions and cutting them off from supplies. Isolated Japanese garrisons were left to starve, sometimes holding out for years after the war had moved on. This strategy saved countless lives, but it also meant that some battles would be unimaginably intense, as both sides understood the strategic value of certain islands. Air power dominated the Pacific skies. Long-range bombers such as the B-29 Superfortress allowed the United States to strike deep into Japanese territory. However, these missions were incredibly dangerous. Mechanical failures, weather conditions, and enemy fighters claimed thousands of airmen. Downed pilots often faced death at sea or brutal treatment if captured. Survival stories from these men revealed the constant fear and isolation that defined aerial warfare over the Pacific.
The psychological toll on soldiers was immense. Continuous combat, constant heat, and the ever-present threat of ambush wore down even the strongest men. Many veterans later spoke of the eerie silence of the jungle before an attack, followed by sudden, explosive violence. Night combat was particularly terrifying, as Japanese forces frequently launched surprise assaults under cover of darkness, using stealth and infiltration tactics. Another defining fact of the Pacific War was the extreme brutality on both sides. The nature of the fighting, combined with racial hatred and cultural misunderstandings, fueled atrocities. Prisoners were often executed, wounded soldiers were left to die, and the rules of conventional warfare frequently collapsed. These actions left deep scars that lasted long after the war ended, shaping memories and national narratives for generations. Technology evolved rapidly as the war progressed. New weapons, improved radar systems, better medical treatments, and enhanced communication networks slowly gave the Allies an advantage. Field hospitals developed advanced surgical techniques to treat jungle wounds and infections. Blood plasma, antibiotics, and rapid evacuation saved countless lives that would have been lost earlier in the war. Despite the horrors, moments of humanity still emerged. Soldiers shared food, letters from home, and quiet conversations during rare moments of calm. These small acts became lifelines, reminders of the world beyond the battlefield. Many veterans later said that camaraderie was the only thing that kept them going through the endless cycle of combat. By the end of this first phase of the Pacific War, it had become clear that this was not a short conflict. It was a war of attrition, endurance, and relentless pressure. Each island captured brought the Allies closer to Japan, but at a staggering human cost. The Pacific was swallowing men, machines, and entire fleets, turning the ocean into a graveyard stretching from Hawaii to Southeast Asia. And this was only the beginning. As the Pacific War moved forward, it became clear that victory would not be achieved through a single decisive battle. Instead, it would be forged island by island at an unbearable human cost. Every new landing brought Allied forces closer to Japan, but also deeper into a nightmare of fortified defenses, fanatical resistance, and landscapes deliberately turned into killing fields. By 1943, both sides understood the stakes. For the Allies, each captured island meant shorter flight distances, new airfields, and tighter pressure on Japan's supply routes. For the Japanese, every island was a final line of defense, a place to delay the enemy at any cost. The result was a series of battles where surrender became rare, survival uncertain, and death almost guaranteed. One of the most revealing aspects of the Pacific War was how deeply the Japanese military prepared for defense. Islands were transformed into underground fortresses. Natural caves were expanded into complex tunnel systems. Hills and ridges were hollowed out to house artillery, machine guns, and sniper positions. Unlike earlier battles where defenders charged head-on, Japanese forces now waited silently, allowing Allied troops to land before unleashing devastating fire from concealed positions. The Battle of Peleliu in 1944 became a grim example of this new defensive strategy. American planners believed the island could be secured in just a few days. Instead, the fighting dragged on for more than 2 months. Japanese troops, entrenched in limestone caves and protected by nearly invisible firing positions, inflicted horrific casualties. Marines described the island as a furnace. Temperatures soared, water was scarce, and the stench of death hung permanently in the air. Heat was an enemy that never rested. Soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion while carrying heavy gear across open ground. Dehydration blurred vision, slowed reactions, and turned simple tasks into exhausting ordeals. Veterans recalled that sweat never dried, uniforms rotted on their bodies, and boots fell apart from constant exposure to moisture and coral. The Pacific War was also a war of relentless noise. Artillery bombardments shook the ground day and night. Naval guns fired from offshore, flattening entire sections of islands. Aircraft roared overhead, dropping bombs and strafing positions hidden deep within the jungle. Yet despite overwhelming firepower, many Japanese defenses survived, protected by rock and earth. Psychological warfare became increasingly important. Leaflets were dropped urging Japanese soldiers to surrender, promising humane treatment. Most were ignored. Many Japanese troops believed surrender would bring shame upon their families or result in torture and execution. This belief was reinforced by military indoctrination and propaganda that portrayed the enemy as cruel and inhuman. The refusal to surrender led to some of the most shocking moments of the Pacific War. Banzai charges, mass infantry assaults, were launched even when defeat was certain. Armed with rifles, bayonets, and sometimes only grenades, Japanese soldiers charged directly into Allied lines. These attacks often ended in total annihilation, leaving fields covered with bodies by dawn. For Allied troops, these moments were terrifying and traumatic. Machine gunners fired until barrels overheated. Medics worked frantically under fire, trying to save the wounded amid chaos. Many soldiers later said the screams and determination of the attackers haunted them long after the war ended. Civilian populations were also caught in the devastation. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, Japanese civilians were drawn into the conflict in tragic ways. Propaganda warned them that capture by Allied forces would lead to torture or death. As American troops advanced, some civilians fled into caves, while others took their own lives rather than surrender. These scenes shocked Allied soldiers, many of whom desperately tried to prevent civilians from killing themselves. The Battle of Saipan in 1944 was a turning point not only militarily but psychologically. Its capture placed American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The loss triggered political shockwaves in Tokyo and led to the resignation of Japan's prime minister. For the first time, defeat was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching the homeland. Air warfare intensified dramatically. With new bases secured, American bombers launched devastating raids against industrial targets. Nighttime firebombing raids turned entire cities into seas of flames. Wooden buildings burned rapidly, creating firestorms that consumed everything in their path. Civilians fled in panic, while emergency services were overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. At sea, submarine warfare strangled Japan's economy. American submarines targeted merchant ships, oil tankers, and supply convoys. By cutting off vital resources, they slowly starved Japan of fuel, food, and raw materials. Sailors trapped aboard sinking ships often had no chance of rescue, disappearing beneath the waves along with their vessels. The Pacific War also witnessed the rise of elite units and specialized tactics. Marine raiders, Army Rangers, and naval demolition teams carried out dangerous missions behind enemy lines. These operations involved reconnaissance, sabotage, and night raids that required exceptional skill and nerve. Survivors of these missions later described them as some of the most intense experiences of their lives.
Medical care continued to evolve under pressure. Field surgeons performed amputations, treated massive burns, and fought infections with limited resources. The introduction of antibiotics, such as penicillin, saved countless lives, but shortages meant doctors often had to make impossible choices about who could be treated. Fatigue became a constant companion. Many soldiers spent months in combat without rest. Sleep deprivation blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Some men spoke to dead comrades. Others became numb to violence, functioning on instinct alone. Psychological trauma, though rarely discussed at the time, was widespread. By late 1944, it was evident that the war was entering its most destructive phase. Japanese resistance grew more desperate as territory shrank. Allied forces, though increasingly dominant, faced the grim realization that invading Japan itself would likely cost millions of lives. The islands captured so far were stained with blood, but they had paved the way for what lay ahead. The Pacific War was no longer about distant outposts. It was now a direct march toward the Japanese mainland, and with that realization came a new terrifying form of warfare that would shock the world. By 1944 and into 1945, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined by desperation. Japan was losing territory, resources were running out, and the once unstoppable expansion of the empire had collapsed into a defensive struggle for survival. Yet instead of surrender, resistance hardened. The closer Allied forces moved toward Japan, the more brutal and costly each battle became. Nowhere was this more evident than in the skies and seas surrounding the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in October 1944, became the largest naval battle in history. Hundreds of ships clashed across vast distances. It was here that a new and terrifying tactic appeared in full force: the kamikaze. Japanese pilots, many barely trained, were ordered to crash their aircraft directly into enemy ships. These were not spontaneous acts of madness, but organized missions rooted in a belief that self-sacrifice could still turn the tide of war. Pilots wrote farewell letters to their families, shared final cups of sake, and took off knowing they would never return. Survivors among Allied crews later described the horror of watching planes dive straight at them, engines screaming, unable to be deterred. The psychological impact of kamikaze attacks was immense. Even heavily armored warships could be crippled or sunk by a single impact. Sailors lived in constant fear, scanning the skies endlessly. Many spoke of the helplessness they felt, knowing that traditional defenses meant little against an enemy who welcomed death. On land, battles reached a level of violence rarely seen before. Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island, became one of the most iconic and brutal engagements of the war. Japanese forces transformed the island into an underground labyrinth of bunkers and tunnels. American forces faced an enemy they could not see, emerging suddenly from hidden positions to attack. The fighting on Iwo Jima lasted over a month. Nearly every inch of ground was contested. Marines described the island as hell itself: black sand soaked with blood, constant artillery fire, and an enemy that refused to give up. By the end of the battle, almost the entire Japanese garrison had been killed. Of the more than 20,000 defenders, only a few hundred survived. Okinawa would prove even worse. Often referred to as the final stepping stone to Japan, Okinawa became the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Over 180,000 Allied troops faced a deeply entrenched Japanese defense, supported by kamikaze attacks at sea. The battle lasted nearly 3 months under relentless rain that turned the island into a sea of mud. Civilians suffered on a scale never seen before in the Pacific. Entire families were caught between advancing armies. Others were forced or convinced that surrender meant death. Tens of thousands of civilians died, either from combat, starvation, or suicide. American soldiers later recalled the unbearable sight of entire villages destroyed and families wiped out. At sea, kamikaze attacks reached their peak. Hundreds of aircraft were launched in waves against Allied fleets. Destroyers, aircraft carriers, and supply ships were hit repeatedly. Medical ships overflowed with burned and wounded sailors. Despite massive losses, Allied naval power held firm, but at a staggering cost. The strain on soldiers and sailors was overwhelming. Combat fatigue became widespread. Men fought through constant shelling, sniper fire, and sudden explosions. Sleep came in short, restless bursts. Letters from home took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Many soldiers admitted that they stopped thinking about survival and focused only on making it through the next hour. As casualties mounted, Allied leaders faced a grim reality. An invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, was being planned. Intelligence estimates predicted casualties in the millions, both military and civilian. The ferocity of Japanese resistance on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa suggested that the home islands would be defended even more fiercely. Meanwhile, American bombers continued to devastate Japanese cities. Firebombing raids destroyed entire neighborhoods. Factories, homes, and infrastructure vanished in flames. Civil defense systems collapsed under the scale of destruction. Civilians lived in constant fear of air raids, unsure if they would survive the night. Despite the devastation, Japanese leadership remained divided. Some sought negotiated peace, while others insisted on fighting to the bitter end. The belief that surrender was dishonorable continued to shape decisions, even as the country faced annihilation. The Pacific War had become a war without return. There was no clear path to victory that did not involve unimaginable loss. Soldiers on both sides sensed that the end was approaching, but how it would come and at what cost remained terrifyingly uncertain.
By mid-1945, the Pacific War had reached a breaking point. Japan's cities were in ruins, its navy shattered, and its air force nearly destroyed. Yet the war continued. Millions of civilians were displaced, industries had collapsed, and food shortages spread across the home islands. Still, surrender remained a word few leaders were willing to speak aloud. American planners faced a decision unlike any before. The projected invasion of Japan promised unprecedented bloodshed. Based on recent battles, military estimates predicted catastrophic casualties on both sides. Soldiers prepared for what many believed would be the most violent campaign in history, while civilians in Japan were mobilized for homeland defense, including women and children trained to resist invasion. In August 1945, the nature of warfare changed forever. Atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing destruction on a scale never before imagined. Entire city centers vanished in seconds. Survivors described a blinding flash, followed by a shockwave that flattened buildings and turned people into shadows burned into walls. Firestorms consumed what remained, while radiation sickness claimed lives in the weeks and months that followed. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. News of the bombings spread rapidly through Japan's leadership. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held territory in Manchuria. The combination of nuclear devastation and the collapse of diplomatic options forced a reckoning. For the first time in Japanese history, the emperor addressed the nation directly. In a radio broadcast on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. His voice, calm and restrained, carried words many citizens struggled to understand. The war was over. Across the Pacific, celebrations erupted. For soldiers who had survived years of combat, relief mixed with grief for fallen comrades. The official surrender took place aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay. Representatives of Japan signed the documents that ended World War II. The Pacific War, which had consumed millions of lives, finally came to an end. The human cost was staggering. Tens of millions were dead across Asia and the Pacific. Entire cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered, and countless veterans returned home carrying physical and psychological scars that would last a lifetime. Prisoners of war slowly emerged from camps, many weakened by starvation and disease, struggling to rebuild their lives. In the years that followed, the Pacific War reshaped the world. Japan underwent occupation and transformation, emerging as a pacifist nation. The United States solidified its role as a global superpower. New international institutions were created in hopes of preventing future conflicts of such scale. Yet the legacy of the Pacific War remains deeply complex. It is remembered for extraordinary courage and sacrifice, but also for extreme brutality and moral dilemmas that continue to be debated. Survivors' testimonies, battlefield relics, and historical records serve as reminders of what happens when ideology, fear, and total war collide. The islands that once echoed with gunfire are now silent. Coral reefs cover shipwrecks, jungles have reclaimed battlefields, but the stories remain. Of young men sent across oceans, of civilians trapped in the crossfire, and of decisions that changed the course of human history. The Pacific War was not just a clash of armies, it was a test of endurance, belief, and humanity itself. Its lessons continue to shape military strategy, international relations, and our understanding of the true cost of war. If you made it to the end of this documentary, leave a comment below and tell us what you thought about the video. Write the keyword Pacific War in your comment so we know you watched until the very end. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and continue watching the videos that are appearing on your screen right now. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that history is never forgotten.